Hello and welcome to Economic Forum, where we discuss various issues affecting our economy in Zimbabwe. These can be issues to do with agriculture, tourism, service delivery, innovation, and many other aspects of life. We bring them here, discuss them, and see how they impact on our economy. My name is John Masugu. Many governments in Southern Africa are being run by former liberation movements, those who fought wars in order to dislodge colonialism. Time and again, these liberation movements that fought the war in Southern Africa meet regularly in order to carry out introspection as to how they are performing in governance, economy, and general development. And they did so recently in South Africa, where they met as a summit, because usually they meet as secretary generals of different political parties. So we're going to be looking at how they've been performing and also how they have planned to move forward in the changing geopolitical situation. And to discuss that, we have Dr. Alexanda Rusero, who is a political analyst, who is going to be helping us to see how the former liberation movements are performing. Welcome to Economic Forum.
Thank you, Mr. Masuku.
Yes. And when we talk about this former liberation movement, we're talking about ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, which is unity between ZANU and ZAPU, which started during the Liberation War as the Patriotic Front. We're talking of FRELIMO of Mozambique. We are talking of the ANC of South Africa. We're talking of MPLA in Angola. And we also bring in SWAPO from Namibia. And Chama Pinduzi of Tanzania, which of course was assisting these liberation movements. The only one missing is UNIP of Zambia, because they are not in government at the moment. So just give us the context of these parties, where they came from as nationalist movements, liberation movements, and forming governments after independence.
I think this is also a critical discussion, because we are discussing about liberation movements in the context of the climate of heroes holidays, heroes commemorations in Zimbabwe. But more importantly, at the backdrop of the recently held summit in Johannesburg of liberation movements of Southern Africa. So they again coincidentally start in South Africa, because South Africa is the umbilical cord of Africa's liberation consciousness, because the African National Congress is one of the oldest political parties in Africa, having been formed in 1910. But you realize that the agenda then went north with the likes of Kwame Nkrumah actually taking it to another level. So in 1957, there was the formation of what was called the Pan-African Movement for East and Southern Africa, PAMFESA.
So this was after the meeting held in the UK, is it?
Yes, but the PAMFESA of 1957, coming immediately after Ghana's independence, was the one that was to map the way forward on the what is the best strategy in as much as decolonization of the entire continent was concerned. That's how we ended up with the frontline states in Southern Africa, for example, given the task to liberate Southern Africa. So all these movements from PAMFESA up to the current status, where we have a forum of former liberation movements, they speak to one thing.
So it's PAMFESA and OAU.
PAMFESA gave birth to OAU. OAU then designated different liberation tasks to different regions: East Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa, etc. So in Southern Africa, that's how we ended up having frontline states, which evolved into SADC with the double C, and now the current SADC with one C. So the whole idea, according to the exaltation by Nkrumah, seek ye the political kingdom first. So the idea was first to get independence, to get freedom, to get decolonization, and the rest would follow. What was the rest? The rest was the economy. Hence the reason why we are discussing this at Economic Forum.
The other interesting aspect that you should also explain is that some of the countries in Africa got their independence without carrying a gun. And then it was necessary as we came down to Zimbabwe, Angola, and so forth to do so. If you could explain why then, the dynamics changed.
Yeah, you will find out that, as you have just made reference to, we are not homogeneous as a continent. That's why Africa remains very complex, even to try to understand the typologies of governments and governance out of that kind of a potpourri, because we are not homogeneous. Those who fought war, they have a certain line of thinking which is very opposed or different from those who for most of the time negotiated independence, with some even given the so-called independence on a silver platter. So those paradigms now will help us understand why there are certain people, certain states with the agency to own the means of production. Then there are others who are still even desperate to appease the spirits of the erstwhile colonizers, because they do not see the agency of total economic emancipation with regards to local people, indigenous people controlling the levers of the economy.
Very briefly, what were the issues? Why did Africa take up arms or come up with all these strategies to dislodge colonialism, which of course we're going to elaborate in the second segment?
Yeah, we always argue that colonialism is not over, but it is all over. So taking arms was one step towards dislodging the evil vices which had entrapped Africa's social, economic, political, economic, and technological advancement by a minority having migrated from the regions of the global north.
And they became in charge of the economies of Africa,
Yes,
and the indigenous people being left behind.
Sure.
That's Dr. Alexanda Rusero, who is our political analyst. Today, we are discussing, Africa, especially the role of liberation movements and how they formed governments, to see how they are performing as former liberation movements in building their economies and developing their countries. Let's join each other in the second segment of the program. Today we are discussing how the former liberation movements are doing in terms of governance and economic development in their countries. They meet quite often to actually carry out a peer review mechanism and strategize for the future, since the geopolitical and geo-economic situation in the world is changing. And to help us discuss that, we've got Dr. Alexanda Rusero, who is a political analyst. Now, Dr. Rusero, I'll just read this title, which is the theme of the recently held summit in South Africa, where the former liberation movements were now discussing at summit level about how they should tackle some of the problems and also strategize for the future. The theme of the conference was defending liberation gains, advancing integrated socio-economic development, strengthening solidarity for a better Africa. So there you are, that's the theme, and it needs to be unpacked. What it means in the context of what you've just been telling us about the history of these liberation movements for a better Africa, for equality and other things.
Yeah, so there are three things to be flagged in that theme. The first one is liberation gains. That's history. History which made us what we are today, coming from a reality of thousands of people who lost their lives to defend, to fight, to claim the territorial integrity, the sovereignty, and the independence of regions, and more importantly of the states that all the gallant fighters are hailed from, freedom fighters, women and men. But there is also issue to do with the social economic advancement and progress. This is now talking to the now, to say the liberation struggle itself must give birth to something, and this something is social and economic advancement. It can't be liberation if it is not punctuated by social freedoms, by economic freedoms, by social autonomy, by economic autonomy. And this social and economic autonomy goes to the third aspect, which is solidarity. Because the moment the independent states try to work in isolation, that's how they are lined up and eliminated. That's how they are lined up, divide and rule by the erstwhile colonizers. Because we always argue that colonization does not die. It is like a salamander. You cut its leg, it grows again. So you need solidarity, the very same solidarity that was used to confront the evil global North Empire is this very same solidarity required now by states working collectively as a collective. Hence this summit. And remember, they are not meeting as states. They are meeting as liberation movements. They are meeting as parties at party level. Because it is at party level where the balance of forces of politics and economics are deliberated. And it is not by coincidence that this is hosted by South Africa, because South Africa is also currently the leader of the G20. And South Africa knows that it is the only African state in that kind of setup, and it wants to leverage that leadership so that it also benefits all other states in Africa, and more importantly from the rest of the global south, hence leaving no one behind with regards to who matters to drive the G20 agenda, of which South Africa is currently the president.
While you are there, you've mentioned an important point that they should work together, but they are coming from different backgrounds. You're talking of Mozambique and Angola, which were under Portuguese rule, and you're also talking about the other states which were under British rule, and another one having also been colonized by the Germans. Is there some congruency coming out of these?
Absolutely.
And also remember, this was happening during the Cold War. I would want you to unpack with that in mind.
Sure. I will go back to where it started, 1884 to 1885, the illegal Berlin Colonial Conference, where some 14 nefarious states gathered and partitioned Africa the way we partition a birthday cake, to say this is your slice, this is your slice. So yes, they could be Lusophone, Anglophone, etc. But the agenda was colonization, to which plunder of the natural and the human resource of Africa was key, was core. So that kind of colonization and colonialism, there is no way one can be better than the other, because the agenda is the same, the umbilical cord. They all rally behind the illegal Berlin Colonial Conference. That's why we resonate with Mozambique, that was colonized by the Portuguese, but we were colonized by the British. Same with Angola, Portuguese. South Africa, it's actually a mixture. So you go to Namibia, it's the same. The whole idea is that these vices of colonialism, the agenda was the same, to benefit the global north at the expense of the global south. And again, it was to counter the emerging tide of an alternative ideological standpoint that was coming from the East, with the emergence of China and the USSR, Soviet Union then, giving communism as an alternative to the vices of capitalism, because colonization rode under capitalism. So there was also need to checkmate the rising influence of communism. That's how you now have communist blocs supporting liberation movements, others being supported by China, others by the Soviet Union Republic. But what matters is that we were all under one vice of colonization, colonialism that was underwritten at the illegal Berlin Colonial Conference.
And the main aim of that conference being to plunder our resources in Africa and grow Europe and other countries,
sure,
to the detriment of Africa.
And the agenda has not changed. What has changed are the actors and the actions. Yes. But the motive remains, that Africa remains a doormat which Europe uses to cleanse its feet and elevate itself to another level. It's up to Africa and the liberation movements to realize that the liberation project is not yet over.
That's Dr. Alexanda Rusero. He's a political analyst And today we are talking about the role of liberation movements in the governments that they are running today in different Southern African countries, to see what lessons were learned during the liberation struggle and how gains can actually be protected. So join us in the third and final segment of Economic Forum. The former liberation movements fought colonialism and gained political independence, but there is still fight for economic independence. And that's what Dr. Alexanda Rusero has just said, that yes, it's now in a different form. Now, this colonialism in a different form, how is it manifesting itself and how can it be eradicated? Because even a young person nowadays meets you if you are going to be providing money and they're going to say, Moro Murungu.
Yes, colonization did not only take place in physical form, that is the physical occupation, the cognitive, our imaginations, our minds. There was also the cognitive colonial project. That's the one that we have to deal with. There was also the lingual one. We are even using English. So we underwent through a process of linguicide, deliberate destruction of the indigenous Afrocentric languages. So recently, a minister of primary and secondary education proposed that it's high time mathematics and biology can be taught in vernacular languages. There was an uproar on social media, people exhibiting naked ignorance to say, imagine a quadratic equation being translated to Isindebele or to Shona. But if we can pray in Shona, if we can pray in Ndebele, if the Bible has been translated in all languages, what's so special about physics or about biology? Safe to say, it's linguicide. We were colonially vanquished with regards to our language. So colonization is different empires. The cognitive, the curricula that we used in schools does not service us. That's why we have several educated African states who can go hungry, who can die of hunger and poverty. Because the education is an instrument. We cannot use colonizers' education to deal with the colonial vices that we face. But back to issue of liberation movements. So you would realize that the whole idea was decolonization. But the question we have to ask is, did we really decolonize? The decolonization project was hijacked by the very same colonizers we were fighting towards the end. That's how we ended up with independence as opposed to decolonization, because they wanted to save humiliation of the white color by the black color, who was about to overrun in cities, marching in Salisbury, in Harare, marching in Maputo, in Mozambique, in Johannesburg and Pretoria in South Africa. That is what Global North wanted to avoid, and we ended up being given independence. And what was the nature of our constitutions? They safeguarded issues of property rights, and who was the property owner? It was the white person. So we must then revisit those remnants of colonization or colonialism. Those are the ones we call coloniality, the atmosphere that promotes the colonial system. We must break those walls of Jericho down so that the real gains of liberation is espoused by this theme are met.
And at that summit, which you are unpacking, our president, Comrade Emerson Mnangagwa, who is the leader of ZANU-PF as a former liberation movement, emphasized on the importance of inclusive development, as well as also uplifting our villages. And we know these villages are found in all these countries.
Yes, and it was in the village that the war was fought more than in the towns, more than in the CBDs, in the cities. But the village has remained behind. Just like the colonial model where urbanites were more advanced, urban cities, towns, as opposed to villages. And the president is alive to that reality. But more importantly, there was consensus amongst all liberation movements to make sure that liberation gains have an appeal to the young demography that we currently now have. Africa is the youngest continent by way of demography. But there is a disconnect between what liberation means, what liberation should mean, between these founding fathers and the youths. The youths, they are questioning the liberation because the dividend of liberation, which is economic emancipation, economic accumulation, has not cascaded to the youths. And it is pleasing to note that the leaders at the summit, they were not shying away from also pointing the shortcomings of the liberation project.
Yes. Now, what are the main issues that the liberation movements should actually look into and address the way you see it as they move forward? Yes, they meet, as secretary generals, they meet as a summit of all leaders, but they still need to address issues to do with peace in different countries. You had Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, issues to do with the governance itself, elections and other things. Do they matter? Because they're always raised at different fora.
They matter because these are desirables. Democracy matters not because it's a Western democracy or it's an import, but because it is always good for a leader to derive the consent to lead from the one that he or she is leading. So we cannot wish away the contemporary fundamentals that matter for our own progress. But remember, we must be doing this for ourselves, not as a tick box or checklist for other people to appraise us, but for ourselves. And we must also start to speak truth to power, to be honest amongst ourselves, especially as liberation movements. How best can we galvanize our economies so that we benefit as a SADC region, complete the process of SADCnization or SADCness, as opposed to working in silos? As Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi, that was under federal rule of whites, prospered. Why is it not prospering now, that kind of unity? A Southern African Customs Union that was started in 1910, SACU, prospered in 1910 under colonization, under colonialism. Why is it difficult to converge now with regards to our currencies, our curricula, our languages, with regards to opening borders? So we have a lot of low-hanging fruits that we can achieve, but it requires political leadership that is very willing and fully expressive, as we witnessed on the Just recently ended summit.
That's Dr. Alexanda Rusero, a political analyst. We've been discussing how the former liberation movements are performing in running government in different countries. We've analyzed where we've come from as former colonized and now independent countries, and how we can go forward in the context of the geopolitical and the geo-economic situation. If you have any questions, you can ask them on the number that is being shown on your screen. If you have any other questions, we can engage about them on the social media platforms that again are flashing on your screen. If you happen to have missed some of the episodes of Economic Forum, you can actually watch them on our YouTube channel, which is Economic Forum Zimbabwe. So on behalf of our guest here, Dr. Alexanda Rusero, a political analyst, and the production crew of Economic Forum, this is John Masugu wishing you happy viewing.